Okay, welcome to the 6th of July, Weekly Marx. We're going to continue looking at study notes for Paul Reitter's translation of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 edition, the Princeton University Press. And we've already looked at the entire text, but I think it's and you can find it on the Medium tag that is there. We're going to just continue to talk about this. Hopefully, you have a copy of the text to work with, but we're generally following along Chapter 1, and we're trying to get to the end of Chapter 1. And I think it's important to see that, as we were looking at before, the idea that the first chapter is important. The concept of the commodity as a more abstract form of approaching the problem. Now, I'm getting to the point here where we left off yesterday, and we were looking at coats and linen and all those same sorts of things. Let me start with reading from the text. This is to give you a note here. There are references in here to things that are actually on the University of California, Berkeley campus. So don't get all flustered. They talk about the Hearst mining building. Anyway, Marx tries to show this as the value of 20 yards of linen, X commodity, X of commodity A, X amount of commodity A, in the active relation, relative position, or form being expressed as one coat in the passive equivalent position or form, that is X commodity B. This is indeed a strange way of expressing the value of linen, leaving aside what kind of property value is. Why express value indirectly as coats, or any use value for that matter? Does linen or any other commodity only have value as so many coats? Are the coats the only thing that gives value to other things, or the only proof that something has value? Now, I'm trying to suggest where all this is headed. Instead of coats, we'll have gold in the equivalent position. So it'll be as so many ounces of gold, or the paper representation thereof in the form of, say, dollar or pound bills, that the value of things is expressed. The value represented by the commodity will have its value expressed externally. Marx uses the strange language of the value objecthood of a commodity. That object will be the money commodity in a certain physical quantity. But it's not that gold has any intrinsic properties that make it the value objecthood of all other commodities. It's just that under the immense pressure of millions of objects produced for exchange, that people converge on a single commodity in which to have value expressed. And this, we haven't really changed from that notion. Needless to say, even Benjamin Franklin proposed paper money rather than gold. Needing a single or perhaps two objects to serve in the equivalent position, people found that gold does have physical properties well suited to express and hold value. It's light, it is divisible, and it is durable. But I've jumped ahead to gold and money. Let's just stay with linen in the relative position and coats in the equivalent position. Now, how many coats are needed to express the value of 20 yards of linen? That will depend on how the labor time required to reproduce each is changing over time. Marx discusses this on pages 31 to 32. Marx then wants to look at the equivalent form or position very carefully. We now know why. He thinks that we'll begin to see where money came from and why it has the property that other commodities do not have, vis-a-vis a monopoly on direct exchangeability. Because once a commodity comes to monopolize the equivalent position and thereby be the one commodity in which all others must have their value expressed, it can be immediately exchanged for any other commodity. All other commodities are effectively on bended knee, begging to be exchanged for the commodity in the equivalent position. That commodity thus gives us an immediate social tie, and it gives that tie to us in abstract form in the sense that the money commodity can be exchanged for any kind of concrete labor embodied in a commodity. So we see a kind of generalization. But we don't need gold or money to see that a commodity in the equivalent position is set off from other commodities, though having been born as any other commodity. So he wants you to try to understand that what Marx calls the three peculiarities of the equivalent form on pages 32 to 34, Marx will put later linen rather than coats in the equivalent position and draw these interesting conclusions. Quote, this is Marx. The linen's own natural form becomes the commodity world's common value shape, and thus the linen can be directly exchanged for all other commodities. Its physical form now counts as the visible incarnation, that is, the general social chrysalis shape of all human labor, or the general form of appearance of human labor as such. The general form of appearance of human labor as such. Note this is general in terms of generalization, and much like he was talking about general intellect. The general value form represents labor products as bare gelatinous blobs of undifferentiated human labor. Now, and its own structure shows that it is the social expression of the commodity world. Now, he doesn't mean the bare gelatinous blob in a literal sense. He just wants to talk about generalization, but I think this is that congealment issue that befuddles some people. This form thus shows that within the commodity world, labor's general human character constitutes its specific social character. In all this, it's being thought of as an abstraction. So when we think of abstract form, we love to think of it as a shape, a common value shape. But, he's talking about in much more general abstract terms. Because it is social, it is about the relationships. All right, the market connects us through the social use value of what is produced. A commodity has to have a social value in use due to the concrete way in which it was made to be exchanged. But the nature of the social connection established by the commodity is entirely in terms of the quantity of abstract labor it represents as expressed in the physical quantity of the commodity in the equivalent position. So this idea of quantity being expressed by something abstract is, problematic. But you need to think of it, more numerically in that context. Much like we think of the differences between cardinal and ordinal, for example. Commodities give us a means to acquire other commodities, yet they give us our social tie only in the quantitative, abstract, and fetishistic form of a quantity of the commodity in the equivalent position. Thusly, social relations can easily appear impersonal but contingent. Now, and don't let go unnoticed the curious nature of money as the materialization of abstract wealth. It's the materialization of abstract wealth. You see, wealth is even a further abstraction. It counts immediately as any and all forms of concrete wealth. It could immediately change form, exchange, or metamorphose into any concrete form of wealth. But abstract wealth, or wealth in the abstract, seems to be only a mental generalization or merely the name of a class of the various forms of wealth. It's as if the Hearst mining building is not only a building belonging to the category of the university's buildings, but the university building itself. The reference is, of course, I think that it is the core of the uh, financial essence of the university in terms of the direct the control itself. Not identical to the administration building. Money can thus appear as a category error because it gives material instantiation to the name of the class of which it is at the same time, but a member. And then, as we will see, money will seem to be the source of its own autonomous process. It's as if fruit were not merely a mental generalization or just a name for various things that have fruitiness in common. Fruit is not only itself a real thing, a fruit among fruits, but an all-important active subject. Because of this generalization, money would seem to have real properties due to a logical error of hypostasis, treating something abstract as if it were real, hypostatus. But its properties are real enough in commodity society. It's not that what is believed to be real is real as the idealist social constructivists would have it. It's that what is implied by practice, here in terms of the exchange of commodities for money, to be real is real. So to try and, work through that, I think it's important to consider that, the point is, like in relationships, it is not necessarily, although you need to have them, of course, takes two to tango, as they say, but it is the relationship between the two that is this third term. And it's abstract. It only exists because the two, in an interpersonal relationship, it is the system of exchange of meanings and messages, etc., between two subjects that makes it objective in that sense. Marx makes a very interesting point here about Aristotle's difficulty with the value form. As noted, Aristotle had trouble understanding value in equivalence, but he did understand that money form has the form of X commodity A equals Y commodity B. That is, Aristotle understood that what is understood as money need not be in the position of B. It could have been another commodity. But he could not understand on what basis the equivalence was being made. So Marx notes at the bottom of page 35 that answers to puzzles or riddles only become possible at certain points in history. Aristotle could not see that the labor in producing commodities was being treated as qualitatively indistinct, and thus as expenditures of the same abstract labor. Now, why couldn't he see this? Because in a slave-owning society, it was impossible to see the slave labor that produced some commodities as qualitatively indistinct from the free labor that produced other things for exchange. Now, we could ask the same question about the context of discovery for Marx to have made a sharp distinction between concrete labor and abstract labor. He will suggest later that due to the creative destruction unleashed by industrial capitalism and workers having to replace old tasks and work with new tasks and jobs, they don't see themselves as defined by the concrete work they do, but rather see their work as but one expression of their abstract capacity for work. This is why we get to labor power. So why couldn't that be what the market measures quantitatively? Now, by raising the question of the historical context or scientific discovery, we can see Marx as an early historical sociologist of science. We could apply the insight and speculate that due to this accelerated change engendered by capitalism, the context was propitious for Darwin to discover incessant change in nature too. Note, though, that the emergence of a context for the discovery of a hypothesis does not itself provide a justification or validation of that hypothesis. Now, using his distinction between concrete labor and abstract labor, Marx will analyze this value form for 10 pages until it stabilizes into all commodities, but one in the relative position and one commodity monopolizing the equivalent position, that is, that one commodity having become money. So, yes, it becomes more generalized. Money is that kind of, it's not so much that it is neutral, but it has that ability to be a further abstraction, another order of abstraction, although order may not be the best term. Now, one point to note here is that Marx assumes that money has to be a commodity that itself materializes so much abstract labor time. For otherwise, how do we know what physical quantity of it, how do we know what physical quantity of it was equivalent to the labor time in those commodities that the money bought? Now, the problem with Marx's theory is that gold or its paper representation is no longer money. That paper or digital entries can no longer be reversed automatically into a fixed quantity of gold. What are we to make of Marx's commodity theory of money today? So there's a link here, and it's a useful link to another article. If today money is fixed loosely, not as a quantity of gold, but to a basket of commodities via inflation targeting, then that would strengthen the connection of money to abstract labor, in that one would necessarily have to abstract from the qualitative differences among commodities in that basket to arrive at the average abstract time to reproduce them. Now, Marx will now discuss commodity fetishism for 12 pages until page 59. Note that Marx means many things by fetishism, but not what would be commonly assumed, i.e., a psychosexual investment people have in the ownership, the possession of things. Marx is not looking at how commodities are imbued with the power to convey qualities and states on their possessors. That is, attractiveness, freedom, cosmopolitanism, athleticism, security, and love, to take a good list from Mark and Ian Hudson. As abstract as value, the meaning imbued by possession could be the reason people want or fetishize commodities. It's not that Marx denies the importance of what commodities attach to a lifestyle mean to the consumer or purchaser, but that is not the focus here. The focus is on our social productive relations being mediated by commodities that seem to have a life of their own, cut off from their origins and production. This is about abstraction. Marx notes that while people are dependent on each other to carry out production or the transformation of nature into objects by which needs can be satisfied, the people on whom we are now dependent have importance only as the owners of the commodities which we desire or need. And those commodities have a bizarre property, their value. It's unlike most properties that things have. It's not available for inspection. It can't be investigated in a lab for the properties responsible for its value. And yet, the value of a commodity will fluctuate over the course of time, changing unexpectedly the quantity of other things that can be acquired by it. Now, Marx wants to suggest that the mystery of a commodity's value evaporates once we analyze that value and price as the result of our social cooperation, namely as the index of whether too much or too little of the labor time that society has been allocated to producing it, and the changing requirements for how much social labor time in the abstract should be devoted to each unit of it. For example, we will not say that we allocated too much of our social labor time to the production of something. Rather, we will say that too much of a thing has been produced for the market, and its price has fallen below the cost of production or value for Marx. Now, for Marx, the latter, that is value, expresses in fetishistic terms, or in terms of things a problem in how we have allocated our social labor time. Now, we may not realize as commodity exchangers, we've made ourselves formally equal as people too. Everything can be sold for money. You know, my money is green, regardless of my color, for example. Everything can be sold for money, meaning that we don't qualitatively differentiate between most productive activities. That, in turn, implies that the labor we do as social labor for each other is qualitatively equal to any other form of commodity-producing labor. Yet, while we have created an interdependence between us through our productive activity and a type of qualitative equality among ourselves, regardless of which commodity we produce, we are still related to each other, not directly or even consciously. We aren't in relations of interdependence with anyone in particular. This is the difference between interpersonal relationships and talking about money, for example. We aren't in relations of interdependence with anyone in particular, or at least we are free to interact with others in the market. This is kind of, our basic model of competition. The relations with other commodity owners come and go, but we seemingly remain who and as we are, that is, separative selves. Now, we may get the sense that we exist individually prior to these relations established by commodity transactions. The myth of self-subsistent individuals, that is the Robinson Crusoe model, as more real than the relations between us and the mistaken ontology that society is built up from these Robinsonades, arises out of a fetishistic society. Now, that's an error. The error of commodity fetishism is not just about objects. It is more profoundly about the kinds of subjects that we are. Now, this is rarely understood and often ignored, in fact. The things that we have to sell and the money with which we buy them seems to rouse us as self-subsistent individuals into social relations. But this implies that we could have existed or continue to exist without social relationships. This is the libertarian problem. We see money and commodities, not the whole or the totality of our cooperative production on which each of us depends. Money, which is a thing, seems to have the power to connect people who would otherwise be indifferent to each other. Other desirable things make us want to connect with the others who own them. Our sociality seems to be the almost accidental result of things, but the value of things and the money in which that is expressed are the result of our cooperating with each other, as we must, not through an inherited division of labor or caste system or conscious planning, but through buying and selling things made privately. This is that difference, the private versus the public. These properties, those things have in a market, that is value for commodities, a monopoly on direct exchangeability for money, these two elements, that enable their orderly social exchange are the result of social action. Our sociality does not then result from inherent properties those things already have. Yet we may find these properties mysterious. They have a supersensible quality through being sensuous things. The value of a commodity can vary independently of anyone's foresight, will, or plan, or derail the life of commodity producers in unexpected ways. Marx is quoting Emerson, a poem, "Things are in the saddle and ride mankind." To this, Marx counterposes the ideal of a free association of producers taking control together of their shared productive activity towards their spontaneously generated ideals. Now, Marx's discussion of social relations having become on the surface mediated by things or commodity relations is contained in the famous section on commodity fetishism, pages 47 through 59. So hence, we have gotten through the end of the first chapter. Now, whether this gets us anywhere, considering the kind of density of the reading, is kind of up to you. You need to sort of work through what he means by all of these little matters that cover many, many pages. But this is the overall view. This is the kind of outline we need to think about. And now then, we're going to begin now with a reading of chapter 2. And we're not reading chapter 2 all the way. And we need to find, as you can see, as I scroll down on the left, all of those things that are in chapter 1 that have been generalized into this one little set of notes. It is important for you not to just read this as a function of the notes, but actually get the reading, read it in its entirety, because it's important to go through all of those equivalent questions about whether, as you can see on the left, the money form issue that we've generalized from 20 yards of linen, which equals 1 coat, which equals 10 pounds of tea, which equals 40 pounds of coffee, which equals 8 bushels of wheat, which equals half a ton of iron, which is X commodity A, which equals 2, all of those things I've just listed are 2 ounces of gold. So it is the movement, the sort of mysticism of all this that is at work. You know, how is it that we can generalize all these matters? So needless to say, we'll begin talking about chapter 2 now, and introduce the notes and then go look at the specificity of the chapter itself. Chapter 2 is on exchange. Marx shows that for commodity exchange to work, each of us comes to be seen as a juridical subject who has the same rights as others over the things that we own, enjoys the sanctity of the contracts one makes with others, and has the freedom to transact to individual advantage in the market. In order for the movement of commodities to be orderly, everyone is assumed to be a juridical subject who can freely alienate whatever property she owns. Marx does not say here, but implies that crime is the appropriation of someone's property without the equivalent exchange or quid pro quo which they expect. Such violent appropriation without the consent or will of the other party undermines the principle of exchange as a quid pro quo activity on which society depends. You know, this idea that the fairness is somewhat, you know, however subjective, does operate. It must therefore be punished, even if food that would otherwise rot is appropriated without consent by a member of a starving family. So, we're all equal before the law as property-owning legal subjects, that we're free to exchange whatever property that we do own. The commodity transactions we make are thus legally enforceable, which means that the possibility of the breach of contract is implicit in every commodity transaction, and that we are therefore organized as possible legal antagonists of each other. If you bought on credit, did you pay up? If you demanded payment in advance of delivery, did you deliver what you promised, or was it defective or unsafe? It's very Trumpian in that sense, transactional in that sense. Our biological individuality becomes legal personhood in the exchange of commodities. And we're morally obligated to believe everyone has equal rights over their property, even if that includes the means of production. Moreover, we pursue our egoistic interests in the market with the protection of moral law and legal personhood. Yet we may wonder whether the legal or the moral, legal, egoistic, moral, legal, egoistic subject is a character mask, like a theatrical mask in ancient Greece, that we must wear once society is organized around the movement of commodities. We are all interpolated equally and formally as traders wanting to truck and barter, to use Adam Smith's expression, with the same legal rights, moral duties towards free and fair exchange, and egoistic interests. Just as the qualitative differences among commodities are dissolved in all being exchangeable for money, the differences among persons are effaced by our juridical equality. Some people resist that, hence that's why we have lawfare. Yet, are all people free and equal bearers of right as they are assumed to be as an individual property holder in the circulation of commodities? Or is this just a pretense that we must have, or persona we must assume in a commodity society? This raises, obviously, a democratic question. The question that will soon become pivotal is this: is our ability to work a kind of alienable property that we own and that we can, as juridical subjects, freely put under the command of another? Such questions are implicit here, but won't be taken up until the end of chapter 8 on the chapter 8 is on the working day. So in this chapter, chapter 2, there's also a repetition of the difficult argument in the prior chapter. And so page 68 is an important summary. Our interdependence is obscured to us because we relate not to other specific people in the market, but to things that we want. Money allows us to get those things apparently without a real relationship to others. In fact, many of our transactions will be one-off and almost all market relations temporary, giving us the illusion that we stand apart from them or are substances in the philosophical sense. Chapter 3, Money. Early in this chapter, Marx discusses how the value of gold itself changes and how gold comes to be linked to the funny things that we have called pounds, pesos, dollars, rupees, yen, etc. This is chapter 3 on money. In this chapter, Marx implicitly differentiates between a barter relation of the exchange of one commodity for another, that is big C dash C prime, C to C prime, and commodity circulation, that is C M C prime, right? So we have commodity to commodity prime and commodity circulation, commodity mediated by money. Marx's discussion of what difference money makes to the movement of commodities from one person to another is rich with insight. And see the second full paragraph on page 86. We create a complex web of interdependence. We can measure degrees of distance from each other, but we also create the possibility of an interruption in the circulation of commodities, that is, a crisis. Money creates the possibility that commodity owners may attempt to make sales without an intention to buy. In barter, one acquires another commodity by trading the commodity one has, usually in real time, right? But once the circulation of commodities is mediated by money, every sale is not necessarily a purchase. Pace says law. Yet, if people are trying to sell without buying, no one may be able to sell. See pages 87 to 88, also the bottom of 94, and also page 111 to 12. Now, much of the chapter is on the quantity of money needed to circulate the immense mass of commodities produced. But we leave this question of technical economics aside. Marx wants to challenge the appearance that a slowdown in the circulation of commodities, CMC prime, is the result of a shortage of money. I shall also leave aside the discussions of paper money, price, and global money. Just makes it more complicated. More fundamentally, we know that money is not only a means to circulate commodities, it becomes an end in itself. Let's be clear on the kind of power that money has. See pages 104, the second paragraph, to page 106. What is the contradiction between money's quantitative limitations and its qualitative limitlessness? Drawing on George Acataphoros, I added that to the extent that money is limited as a stock, one only has so much of it, or to put it another way, has a budget constraint. The process of continuous investment can replace a finite stock of money with a limitless flow of money. With money making, an infinite sequence of finite sums, that is, an infinity in time, becomes the substitute or the form of satisfying the desire for an infinite stock, a timeless infinity. So an infinity in time versus a timeless infinity. Now, that all sounds, kind of metaphysical, but it is this question of the interchangeability of stock and flows using money. As we will see, for there to be an infinite sequence of finite sums, the production process will have to be revolutionized. So packed in those couple of sentences is a much larger concept of thinking about stock and flow, which is really important further on. Chapter 4, the transformation of money into capital. Marx differentiates between the circulation of commodities, we looked at this above, C-M-C prime. This is big C, big M, C prime, and the general formula for capital itself, that is M-C-M prime. So in C-C prime, every sale is necessarily a purchase. In CMC, the goal is another use value, something qualitatively different, and the process is infinite, or is finite, I'm sorry. CMC prime, the goal is another use value, something qualitatively different, and the process is finite. Value is the means for the circulation of use value. It's something that motivates in that particular sense. C-M-C prime also has within it the possibility of crisis. M-C-M prime, that is M-C-M prime, the goal is value itself. The end value is compared to the initial value in quantitative terms, and this process is potentially infinite. So you can see that there's a tension here between moving in one direction or moving in an infinite direction and tearing against a kind of finite reality. Now, what does Marx mean by the occult quality that value acquires in the circuit of capital? And see the bottom of page 128. Why does Marx say that surplus value, defined as the difference between M prime and M, both cannot have originated in circulation and must have originated in circulation? This kind of paradox is called an antinomy. See pages 132 to 140. Now, this antinomy is actually kind of important because it goes with respect, logically back to Hegel, but, we won't go there for the moment. Once you figure out how Marx's explanation for the systematic increase of surplus value in the system as a whole pivots on the distinction between labor power and labor, remember that we discussed several criticisms of Marx's theory of surplus value. That is, we don't have a way of verifying that the value of labor power, remember, this is not labor, but labor power, is less than the value that labor creates in production. If the value of labor power qua potential energy, this is that idea of a certain expectation that labor power provides when, when labor power is a commodity itself, that is, you see a job on offer, et cetera, is less than the value created by the kinetic energy released by using labor power, then the value of coal qua potential energy may be less than the value created by the kinetic energy of the steam engines and machines set alive by burning coal. So there's a kind of interesting comparison. It's a criticism. Note that this is a criticism of the surplus value argument. Workers are not necessarily exploited if they receive payment before the new value in commodities is finally realized in the market. Their wage represents the value that they will have added, properly discounted. So this is, as described elsewhere, this idea of what counts as added value in the process. Another kind of question to ask. The difference between the time it takes to build a machine and the time that a machine runs could also be a source of surplus value. So the idea or the concept of surplus value is one that is at scale, is about adding value, has other kinds of elements built into it, seems more complex, seems to be located within the context of the production process, and there's an argument there, but that's for other discussions. That often the most mechanized firms in a branch of industry, not the firms exploiting the most labor, make the most profit. So that technical difference is important. There's no reason to think management and entrepreneurship don't also add value to the produced commodities. And It's possible to calculate prices and profit rates just based on the technical conditions of production, even in a fully automated economy. So how can labor time be behind or the essence of prices and profits? See criticism of the labor theory of value number 3. But now assume that the truth of Marx's theory of surplus value, and note the ironic way in which Marx describes the worker as free on page 142, second paragraph, and the distinction that Marx makes between labor power and labor on page 148. Describe how Marx's specific praise for the realm of circulation, what does he seem to be praising or lauding, is ironic on page 148 to 49. Are there dangers to his ironic dismissal of bourgeois accomplishments? So he's being sarcastic, right? Should we dismiss the realm of circulation in which freedom, equality, property, and Bentham prevail as no more than the illusions in Plato's cave, is the Plato's cave allegory, compared to the reality of despotism at the site of production? Do note, as Robert Paul Wolff has underlined, that Marx has inverted Plato in that truth is, for him, in that dark abode of production, not in the open light of the marketplace. So, or one could say that due to the dazzling illusions spun off from the realm of circulation, we see ourselves living in the matrix, not in the desert of the real. Jean-Paul Sartre captures the way in which the labor contract both realizes and denies freedom, and both legitimizes the capital-labor relation and capital's indifference to the suffering that results from it. Well, and though this contract necessarily transforms labor or praxis into an inert commodity, it is formally a reciprocal relation. It is a free exchange between two people who recognize each other in their freedom. It is just that one of them pretends not to notice that the other is forced by the constraint of needs to sell him or herself, to sell themselves as a material object. The clear conscience of the employer is based entirely on that moment of exchange in which the wage laborer appears to offer his labor power in complete freedom. And if he is not free in relation to his poverty, he is juridically free in relation to his employer, since, at least in theory, the employer does not put any pressure on the workers when he hires them and merely fixes a top rate and turns away those who ask for more. Here, once again, competition and antagonism between workers moderate their demands. The employer himself has nothing to do with it. This example shows clearly enough that man becomes a thing for the other and for himself only to the extent that he initially posited as human freedom by praxis itself, that he is initially posited as human freedom by praxis itself. Absolute respect for the freedom of the propertyless is the best way of leaving him at the mercy of material constraints at the moment of the contract. So, Sartre, as you might call him an existentialist, is trying to deal with this kind of set of contradictions, or the paradox that you have sort of control, but you don't have control. And that the contract sort of represents that problematic element. Note that for the labor contract to be binding on the worker, specifically that she has alienated the work product for a wage to the capitalist who alone owns it, then the worker must not only be considered free to have made what should be a binding contract, a coerced contract would not be binding. Her person must also be understood to reside in her choice-making capacities, not her actual activities. She is certainly not free in the latter sense, that is, in the actual activity. She is under the command of bosses. Commodity exchange gives us a theory of who the person essentially is. That is, the person is herself in her autonomous choice-making in what her will wills, not what her body does. We could say that this is Cartesianism, that is the mind-body, dualism. But today, the Severance show will more readily come to mind. The real person is the one who chooses to be severed from the memories from their embodied work as innies. This point of severance is well explained by Bhikkhu Parekh. That is, quote, again, in order to argue that an individual could sell his labor to others, his physical and mental capacity and activities of which his labor ultimately consists must be considered alienable and therefore not an integral and inseparable part of him. The classical Athenian believed that to render any form of service, especially the physical, to another man in return for money, even if for only a short time, was a form of slavery and unacceptable to a free man. Now, class makes that easier. Now, since the bourgeois mode of production required that men should be free to sell their labor, that is, their skills, capacities, and activities to others, it is, it had to define the individual so that we're not just considered an integral and inseparable part of him. He had to be seen as somehow separate from and only contingently related to them, so that he is not believed to be sold when they are, and is doomed to remain free even when his activities and skills are no longer under his control. Now, in order to say that his freedom is not compromised when his abilities, skills, and activities are placed at another person's disposal, he had to be defined in the barest possible manner. Quote, since almost everything about an individual is considered alienable, that is, skills, capacities, and activities, the crucial question arose as to what was to be considered essential to him, such that its alienation was his alienation, and his loss of control over it amounted to the loss of freedom. That is, the bourgeois society, by and large, located his essential humanity in the interrelated capacities of choice and will. For it, they represented man's differentia specifica and were the bases of human dignity. The individual was, above all, an agent. As long as the individual is not physically overpowered, hypnotized, or otherwise deprived of his powers and choice and will, his actions were uniquely theirs, and therefore sole responsibility. It did not matter how painful the alternatives were, how much their character had been distorted by their background and upbringing, and how much their capacities of choice and will were debilitated by their circumstances. As long as they were able to choose, their choices were their responsibility. The individual is abstracted from their social background and circumstances, which could not be considered co-agents of and co-responsible for his actions. They stood alone, all by themselves, stripped of their social relations, circumstances, and background. In a word, their social being, as Marx called it, faced the world in their sovereign isolation, and like God, exercised their conditioned freedom of choice and will. In short, their conditions of existence required the bourgeoisie to equate the individual with an abstract mental capacity, namely the capacity to choose and will, and to define him in asocial and idealist terms. When the individual is so austerely conceived, the question arises as to how they're related to, the alienable body and mental activities and powers. They cannot be conceived of as their modes of being, the ways in which they express themselves and exist for themselves and others. They can only be understood as something they have rather than they are. The bourgeois writers appropriate them as his properties, in which the legal language becomes their possessions. If they refer to the totality of their being and not merely to the will of choice, their power and activities would be seen as an integral part of them, as constitutive of them, and therefore not as their possessions which they could dispose of at will. They would not be able to alienate them any more than they could alienate their will or choice. And their so-called freedom to sell their capacities and activities would appear not as freedom, but slavery. So that goes a long way to talk about the more philosophical elements of chapter 4, and we'll get back to that, I suppose. We'll look at chapter 5 probably and 6 and then stop. And next week, we will try and consider the more specific elements of the text, but also move a little bit farther forward, because what I want to do is get to the end of the notes and then sort of try to see whether the totality of the notes does a good representation of the text itself. Chapter 5, the labor process and the valorization process. There's much of philosophical interest in this chapter, that is chapter 5. What distinguishes production by human animals from the production of other animals? Page 154. Now, why does Marx think human animals are distinguished by widespread tool making and different historical epochs by the tools that are used? Page 155. How use values can be differentiated as raw materials, means of labor, and products. Page 158. How labor preserves gratis the value of raw materials and the means of labor, and what is the difference between individual consumption and productive consumption on page 159. What are the features of the labor process when capitalists command it and consume labor power? One that is the product belongs to the capitalist. One of these features is that the product belongs to the capitalist. This is a question of ownership. Why does Marx say that the selling of labor power is not unfair to the worker, although he also thinks that the worker is exploited? The top and bottom of page 169. Do note that if the capitalist can only secure the inputs on the market for production, then he will have risked and lost his money if he hasn't produced commodities for a greater sum of money than he has invested. He could have enjoyed risk-free interest had he deposited the money in a bank. In fact, if he does not want to lose his money capital, he is compelled to valorize it. Only then will he remain a capitalist. And in this way, the labor process has become a valorization problem. In this way, the labor process has become a valorization process. It will take generations, however, for capital to change the production process according to its valorization demands. This will be history that Marx provides in those chapters on cooperation, manufacture, machinery. So Marx is getting to value, but he's only going to be able to do it when you see, historical materialism sort of at work, at progress, growth, development, etc. Scale. Chapter 6, constant and variable capital. Now, this chapter is foundational but straightforward. What's the difference between constant and variable capital? What gets counted as each? What is special about variable capital? Note that the page citations to Marx don't match the edition that we're using. I have a copy of the Polylux available. That's uploaded into Discord. Chapter 7, the rate of surplus value. How does the decomposition of the new value added into variable capital and surplus value allow us to calculate the rate of surplus value? There's a lot packed in that one phrase. Where has the value invested in constant capital gone? Or to put it another way, why is the value of the product not the same as the value that has been newly created? This is on page 186. There's a lot packed into that one little paragraph, and this is the question, that allows us to make more abstract questions and also to see that surplus value is a thing. It's really an important thing. It is what drives capitalism forward. When Marx calls necessary that part of the working day that produces the quantity of product that, upon sale, will equal the value of labor power and thus the variable capital, how has he given a new second meaning to necessary labor time? This is, as the note writer will say, it's tricky again, but see page 189. Why is the rate of surplus value, that is S over V, the same thing as the ratio of surplus labor to necessary labor? Now, remember, we're comparing rate and ratio, not the things themselves on page 90. Let us assume that 1 hour of labor equals $1 because $1 represents the quantity of gold that it has on average taken 1 hour to mine, that is to dig out of the ground. Now, if workers work for 12 hours, they've created $12 of new value. If the value of the goods they have to consume to work for 12 hours only takes 6 hours to produce, this about sustenance, right? They will, in half of their working day, produce enough product to cover their wage or the variable capital that has been invested, assuming labor power is sold at its value. The rate of surplus value will be 100% and can be expressed as 6 hours surplus labor over 6 hours of necessary labor, or as $6 of surplus value produced and $6 to cover the wage or the variable capital, or as 1/2 the quantity of the new product objectifying the surplus value over 1/2 the quantity of the new product objectifying variable capital. Now, these are 3 different ways of saying the rate of surplus value is 100%. And now this summarizes a whole bunch of stuff here. So, it's necessary to sort of look at that much more closely and also sort of put up with Marx's numbers. We're close to the end now, and I won't talk about the working day, but that is the key to differentiating between absolute and relative surplus value. But it conceptually is important because we've just introduced it, the difference between, what is necessary and what is unnecessary, or paid and unpaid, and a variety of other kinds of direct and indirect relations that are kind of at work in thinking about production. So I'm going to stop here and note that we will get back to next week and continue to plow through this. So, we're going to look at a whole bunch of things, and we'll get to the end probably next weekend. And you'll be sufficiently annoyed that this is a kind of reduced volume 1 into this system of notes. But like the problem of Cliff Notes, it doesn't quite describe all of the issues. There's a lot of things going on, and it makes less sense if you don't actually read the text itself. This is meant to, kind of compress the meaning. Now, the point at the end is whether this set of notes by our friend Rakesh Bhandari is a proper representation of those issues. As you've seen, I've made minor, sort of annotations as to what they are or aren't. And of course, I should get in there and correct his grammar, etc. But it's kind of important to get the key point of this, and particularly the notation, the notes for the new edition. And I think at some moment we'll be able to look at them more directly. So that's my little presentation on this. This is the 6th of July, Weekly Marx. We've been looking at the notations by Rakesh Bhandari for Volume 1 for Paul Reitter's and Paul North's translation and editing of Marx's Capital Volume 1, the Princeton edition 2024, which is the first edition in several decades. And, it's hard to say that it will be the standard in English translations, but it is, I think, important to see that certain idiomatic things have been covered, certain underlying elements that need to be addressed, particularly from the, as it were, the humanist side, that are available also in this edition. That is William Clare Roberts' afterword is, I think, really important, as is the forward. So anyway, all of those things are, I point out that you might stare at a little bit. So I'm going to stop now and turn off the live screen.